If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. By early May 1864, Union Major General William T. Sherman assembled his army groups to confront Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston and the Army of Tennessee. Sherman initially wanted to use the Army of the Cumberland and the Army of the Ohio to hold Johnston in place while the Army of the Tennessee marched on and captured Rome, Georgia. This plan fell apart when not all of James McPherson's Army of the Tennessee could make it on time to launch the campaign. So Sherman altered his plan. He would send McPherson on a not as wide swing to cut the railroad south of Johnston at Resaca, Georgia, and as Johnston pulled back to protect his line, the army group would converge on the Army of Tennessee and destroy it or scatter it to the east. Johnston placed most of his troops under the command of John Bell Hood on the north end of Rocky Face Ridge, north of Dalton, and kept William Hardee's corps at Dalton. Only a small force of about 4,000 men guarded Resaca. On May 9, 1864, while Thomas and Schofield distracted Johnston north of Dalton, McPherson pushed his army through Snake Creek Gap and to within sight of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, but McPherson got scared that the force that he was encountering was much larger, and that Johnston had pulled his troops away from Dalton to confront the Union advance. So he pulled back to Snake Creek Gap. McPherson ruined a great opportunity for Sherman to have interjected a large force between the Confederate Army and Atlanta, forcing that army to move or be nearly surrounded. Johnston received word of the large Union force getting close to Resaca, and he dispatched part of Hood's troops to Resaca to block the advance. Hood reported that there were no Union forces within 4 miles of Resaca, which calmed Johnston a little, but he still needed to figure out what Sherman was up to. Sherman decided to move most of his army through Snake Creek Gap and began moving them down the west side of Rocky Face Ridge, leaving only the 4th Corps to fight the rear guard of Johnston's army as it retreated toward Resaca. The Union troops moved through the night toward the gap. Soldiers with torches marked the way in the darkness, and during the day officers were posted to keep the men following the right roads. Fresh from his stint in Mississippi and Alabama, Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk arrived at Resaca with his lead elements to bolster the Army of Tennessee's numbers. Johnston and the Confederate War Department desired Polk to come to Georgia to help Johnston fight off Sherman. When Polk arrived at Resaca, he took over the defenses of the town. Hood, Polk, and some other generals rode together surveying the land around Resaca. One soldier remembered the scene. The generals, together upon their horses, upon a rising ground, evidently very calmly surveying the scene of the expected conflict. There is evidently a heavy thing on hand, for the troops are pouring in from Dalton. The enemy's force is estimated at 150,000 with a large amount of artillery. After the survey, Hood returned some of his troops back to Dalton. Polk accompanied Hood north, where they met with Johnston. Perhaps stirred by the religious fervor taking place around Dalton, as soldiers were being baptized in a nearby creek, or maybe coming to grips with his own mortality after being wounded twice in 1863, Hood asked Polk, the Episcopal bishop and warrior, to baptize him in an unconventional ceremony. Hood stood with crutches instead of kneeling, and the water used to baptize Hood was held in a tin horse bucket. There stood the battered old hero, barely 30 years old. There the warrior bishop, Polk, and there stood your humble servant, with a flaring yellow candle in one hand and a horse bucket of water in the other. To Polk's question, "Dost thou renounce the devil and all his works, the vain pomp and glory of the world, with all covetous desires of the same, and the carnal desires of the flesh, so that thou wilt not follow, nor be led by them?" Hood replied, "I renounce them all." The next day, Polk returned to his troops at Resaca, as Johnston attempted to discover Sherman's plans. When a party of soldiers probed Sherman's lines, they discovered only a small force remained. Sherman was on the move. Johnston began moving troops to Resaca to block Sherman's flanking attempt, setting the stage for the first major battle of the Atlanta campaign, the Battle of Resaca. Johnston positioned his army in the defenses around the town of Resaca, with his left flank on the Oostenaula River and his right flank on the Conasauga River. The Confederate Army beat Sherman's mammoth force to the town and now waited for the Union soldiers to assault their position. On the morning of May 14th, most but not all of Sherman's force was in position around the city. John Schofield's Army of the Ohio occupied the left flank, with the 14th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland on its right. Sherman wanted the two corps to swing like a door, driving the Confederates toward the town. The divisions of Jacob Cox and Henry Judah from the Army of the Ohio, and Absalom Barrett and Richard Johnston's divisions of the Army of the Cumberland stepped off for the attack. Because the units were swinging to the rightmost brigades made contact with the Confederate line first. Those brigades were unsupported because of the swing and began to fall back as the rest of the attacking column made its swing to the right. Judah's division overlapped Baird's division, creating confusion in the assault. A member of Baird's division remembered, "The face of the country was very rough, rising and falling in a succession of high hills and deep gorges, covered with an almost impenetrably dense growth of timber, rendering it a very difficult matter for troops to advance in line. On reaching the second line of hills, we passed our skirmish line and were struck by the enemy's formidable line. Our advance was here to some extent checked, some of the men in the line stopping and lying down behind the crest of the hills. But the main portion of the lines rushed down the hill and charged toward the enemy's works, under a most murderous fire of canister and shell from the enemy's batteries, as well as the musketry from their lines. Our lines suddenly found themselves confronted by a deep, narrow stream with quicksand in places and steep, muddy banks. Our troops sprang into the creek and opened fire on the rebel lines. The attack proved too devastating to the Union columns, and they began to fall back. For the uncoordinated assault and for the fact that some of the men hadn't been formed into assault columns, Judah was relieved of command a few days later. As Cox's division hit the Confederate line, all of Otis Howard's corps began to show themselves on the Union left, but they weren't able to join the attack. The assault on the angle of the Confederate line was a brutal struggle as the Union troops maneuvered over the difficult terrain only to be hit with incredible amounts of musketry and artillery fire. A Tennessean in the Confederate ranks remembered, "Onward they came. The gallant Kentuckians were standing to their work like men, but were about to be overpowered, when Robert C. Tyler's brigade that was laying over behind the hill was ordered to their support, and when Tyler reached the Kentuckians' line, the second repulse was complete in 10 minutes. The Union line fell apart and withdrew to a safe distance, and when they did, the Union artillery began to blast away at the Confederate entrenchments. At one point, a shell fell into one of the rifle pits, where it lay sizzling and ready to explode. Lieutenant F.M. Clark and A.H. Lankford each grabbed at it, and together threw it out of the works. It exploded before it struck the ground. The 4th Corps formed the extreme left of the Union line, but the divisions of that corps didn't reach all the way to the Conasauga River. Johnston realized the opportunity this afforded. The Union flank was in the air, and if he could turn it, Sherman's grip on Resaca would loosen. 2 divisions from Hood's corps made up the extreme Confederate right flank, one division under Carter Stevenson and the other under Alexander P. Stewart. Elements from the 2 divisions attacked at 5 p.m. Although they began their movement at the same time, the longer distance that Stewart had to cover caused his division to need reforming, so he halted it for that purpose while Stevenson continued on. Despite just 2 brigades from Stevenson's division attacking the Union flank, the Confederates sent the troops under David Stanley back, relentlessly pushing the surprised Federals. For some, it became a foot race to get to safety. The Union brigades gradually fell back, but a lone artillery battery remained, the 5th Indiana Light Battery, commanded by Captain Peter Simonson. It was marvelous to witness the rapidity with which the artillery was fired as the danger of capture became apparent to the cannoneers. Perhaps never were 6 guns made to do more rapid and destructive work. They were filled again and again, almost to the muzzle, and fired so rapidly the rebel prisoners captured soon afterward refused to believe that but a single battery had played upon them. The stubborn stand by the Hoosiers, along with the Federal troops from Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps, arriving from their position on the right flank, sent Stevenson's men back to their entrenchments. As night fell on May 14th, neither Johnston nor Sherman could dislodge the other from the position. So far, Joseph E. Johnston had held off William T. Sherman's attacks along his line and even launched an offensive himself against the exposed Union left flank, but that was thrown back by Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps. At about the same time that Stevenson's division was fighting on the Confederate right, another major attack was taking place on the Union right flank. James McPherson and Corps Commander John A. Logan could hear the rattle of musketry and the roar of cannons on the left flank and wanted to prevent Leonidas Polk in their front from sending troops to aid the Confederate right flank. Plus, there were some hills in their front that, if captured, would allow Union forces to batter the Confederate entrenchments, the railroad, and the town of Resaca. At 6 p.m., a bugle rang out, and Logan's men stepped off toward the Confederate works. The men of the 15th Corps nobly dashed through a hailstorm of lead and iron, which belched forth from the enemy batteries and rifle pits. Reaching the base of the hill, they climbed the slope, and, running over the crest of the first undulation in the eminence, fairly effected lodgment under cover of a dip in the plateau. The hurrah of thousands of admiring friends followed the onward march of this command. The overwhelming numbers were too much for the rebels, and they broke, being swept from the field and driven to the west toward the second set of entrenchments. There were some brave spirits in both regiments who continued to pour it into the enemy from behind trees while the Federals occupied the crest of the ridge. We stopped all the men we could and put them into our line. I said to one fellow, "Halt, what are you running for?" He answered, "Because I can't fly." The attack allowed the Federal soldiers to gain the upper hand by capturing the hills from which they could pour artillery fire into the town. Polk realized the precarious situation and organized his men for a counterattack. His troops advanced toward the Union soldiers, now using the rebels' own works against them. One Union soldier remembered, "These dispositions were scarcely made when our skirmishers were driven in, followed closely by the enemy, who had massed a large force in our front and seemed determined to retake the position at all hazards. Colonel Americus Rice, 57th Ohio, in whose immediate front they were advancing in column by regiments, opened a murderous fire by rank, and with deadly effect. Other portions of the line on the left also delivered a well-directed fire on their flank, notwithstanding which they advanced to within 30 yards of our line before they were checked, and then only fallen back to reform and renew the attack, threatening my right flank. They were again repulsed and again rallied for another onset. By 8 p.m., Polk abandoned his attempt to regain the former works in the hills, and he recalled his men. The attacks launched by Logan and McPherson threatened to cut the Confederate army off from the south. Johnston's back was already against a river, and now his left or southern flank was threatened to be turned. He would be completely surrounded if the Union soldiers broke through on Polk's flank. Sherman didn't take advantage of this precarious situation. Instead, he ordered his troops to dig in. Johnston seemed unaware of the problems that Logan posed on his left flank, and instead ordered a daybreak attack on the Union left flank. But the time of the attack was changed to noon, but Carter Stevenson and Alexander Stewart didn't receive their orders until 3 p.m. It was determined for the two divisions to launch their attack at 4 p.m. On the other side, Sherman also ordered an attack around 4 p.m. A series of miscommunications led to a flailing attack by the rebels. Confederate Major General William H.T. Walker was south of Resaca guarding the crossings of the Oostenaula River. He detected Union troops moving across at Lay's Ferry and reported it to Johnston. In reality, it was just one division from Grenville Dodge's corps, but Walker surmised that it would be a major movement by the entire Union army. Johnston got worried and called off the attack, but word couldn't reach Stevenson and Stewart before they launched their assault. In reality, only Stewart attacked. Stevenson believed he was simply ordered to support Stewart, not launch his own assault. Either way, Joseph Hooker's 20th Corps collided with the rebel division in their own attack, driving Stewart's men back to their entrenchments. Behind their dug-in position, the Confederates played havoc on the approaching Federals, but some of the blue troops got close enough to the entrenchments to make the rebel artillery ineffective, and they dug in close to the rebel works. As the sun began to set, Union troops got to work attempting to capture the 4-gun battery in their front. One soldier who took part in the event remembered, "As soon as night had fallen, a strong detachment of determined men crept silently under the little fort and began removing the earth, logs, and stones of which it was constructed. Their work was overheard by the vigilant enemy, and a sharp engagement followed, which lighted up the whole crest of the hill. But while their comrades fought, these sappers and miners continued their work, and near midnight, when all was ready, a sudden dash was made, the drag ropes made fast, and with a burst of cheers and laughter, the 4 guns were sent trundling down the hill to the rear of the Union lines." Hooker's attack failed, other than capturing the battery. During the night, Johnston contemplated what to do next. If Walker's report was true, then the Union Army would soon cut him off from Atlanta. That was too great of a risk for Johnston, and he pulled his army out of the entrenchments around Resaca on the night of May 15th and headed toward Adairsville. At Resaca, Sherman lost about 2,700 troops, and Johnston lost about 2,800 soldiers, a total of about 5,500 casualties. Johnston at first thought he could defend the valley the town of Adairsville sat in, but his army couldn't occupy the needed space to prevent Sherman from moving down the valley. Union forces moved down toward Adairsville, and prepared to attack Johnston's position, but Johnston had other plans. He moved William Hardee's corps down the railroad and moved John Bell Hood and Leonidas Polk's corps down a road leading from Adairsville to Cassville. Johnston wagered that Sherman would divide his force to come after the rebel army, and when he did, 2 of Johnston's corps would defeat one contingent in detail. Just as Johnston believed, Sherman separated his force and moved south. Hooker's 20th Corps, along with John Schofield's 23rd Corps, moved on the eastern flank. The 4th and 14th Corps under George Thomas moved down the railroad, and McPherson's 2 corps swung to the west. Johnston concentrated his forces near Cassville, with Hood on the right facing west, Polk blocking the road to Cassville, and Hardee on the left, watching the road from Kingston. On May 19th, Sherman's columns continued their march toward the Confederate position, and as Schofield and Hooker came down the road, Hood's corps swung to the left to attack them in the flank. But when Hood formed his men, he detected Union troops on his right flank and possibly behind him. Although Johnston would protest that no troops were on his flank, Federal cavalry were on the flank in heavy numbers to protect the 2 Union corps. With no attack possible, Johnston pulled his army back to Cassville and occupied a ridge outside of the town. Union guns were trained on the Confederate position and delivered destructive volleys into the rebel ranks. It became so untenable that both Hood and Polk requested to move farther south or allow them to launch an attack. Johnston authorized the retreat. The Confederate Army's morale plummeted as they constantly retreated. A Confederate officer wrote to his wife around this time that, "I've seen so much beautiful country given up to the enemy as to be made unhappy by it. You cannot imagine how disheartening it is, and at the same time humiliating, to see the apprehension of the people of a country abandoned to the enemy. I had rather have the agony of defeat as far as my own feelings are concerned." The officer who wrote that letter was Joseph E. Johnston.